Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn, or Learning and Lunch, sponsored by the Lainer family. And this year, since every year we do something different for the class, this year will be the I get myself in trouble year, because what I intend to do is to take contemporary and contentious topics and teach you what Judaism has to say about them. The reason I'll get myself into trouble is that what Judaism has to say about them and what you or even I believe about them may be different. And I intend to give you both sides of the sources, things that support one side of the political or social or cultural divide, as well as the others, so that you can decide from a position of knowledge, as opposed to just saying, well, Judaism says this based on one verse that you heard, or one story that was told to you by your rabbi, or one position that is in fact less representative of the totality of our tradition than a much more penumbral, a much broader account of what Judaism actually has to say. And I thought that I would start today with a fairly easy one. Later on, I hope we will get into things like immigration, abortion, women's rights, other sorts of issues that the Jewish tradition has things to say about, and that we should look at and at least hear and understand. Whether you accept or not is a different question. But I do want to start with free speech, in part because it is so common for Jews to talk about how Judaism favors free speech. And in these days of cancel culture and censorship and self-censorship and discouraging of free exchange of ideas, many Jewish thinkers, myself included, have sometimes turned to the Jewish tradition to give us a more expansive sense of what speech is about. So let's actually look at what Judaism has to say about free speech, and whether this will bolster your political opinions or not, I cannot say. All I can tell you is that what I'm going to give you are well-sourced ideas in Judaism, as you will see. First of all, the idea that human beings have speech is a central idea in the Jewish tradition. In fact, Onkelos, who was the early Aramaic translator of the Torah, when God creates human being, Onkelos' translation is a speaking animal. That is, human beings are characterized by the faculty of speech. Other animals communicate, but they don't have speech, not the way we do. As Bertrand Russell once said, no dog can tell you that his father was poor but honest. The subtlety of communication that is characteristic of human beings, that is characteristic of this moment, is a unique achievement on this earth of our species. The second characteristic of speech with human beings is that it is sometimes of negligible value, worth, or impact, and sometimes it's very potent. There are certain things you can say that actually change the way the world is. This is a famous comment by Austin, an English philosopher, about performative speech. When the rabbi, priest, clergy says, you are now husband and wife, or with a rabbi at the end of the Sheva Brachot, which are just words, all of a sudden the state of the world is different. They are now husband and wife. So there are things you can say that actually bring about a change in the state of things in the world. And therefore, speech and its potency and its power is something that every society has to reckon with. As you might expect, in social orders that have been characterized by monarchies, by rulers, by kings, suppressing speech, stepping on it, diminishing it, minimizing it, has been a normal way of dealing with speech you don't like. One of the common ancient tortures was cutting out people's tongues when they said something that the king disapproved of. And that idea of eliminating the speech that you not only that you didn't like, but you thought would badly influence other people, that you didn't want others to hear, that was dangerous in one way or another. This is as old as humanity. It is not new, cancel culture. It takes different forms in different times, but there were always things. Think about all the speech codes that existed in the movies, all the things you couldn't say 100 years ago. In polite society, all the things you couldn't say 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago. Restriction of speech is not new. Freedom of speech is, while not new, I think the degree to which we accord it reverence, while I'll go back to some of its roots, is fairly unprecedented. Now, let's go to the Torah. The Torah never mentions freedom of speech as an abstract principle. Never. Nowhere in the Torah does it say human beings should be allowed to say whatever they want, because the Torah doesn't work that way generally in abstract principles. But even so, the speech of characters in the Torah is itself clearly restricted, because blasphemy is not permitted. To curse God is forbidden. So early on, there are restrictions on the kind of speech that one is allowed to pronounce, and that's taken for granted, because after all, God is king. Can't say anything you want about the king. We all know this, right? However, there are counter examples as well. So, for example, when Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp, and Joshua comes in and says to Moses, "This is terrible. These two other people who have no license, no authority, no designation from God, no anything, they're prophesying in the camp." Moses says, "I wish all the Lord's people would be prophets." In other words, let them speak. And clearly, we do see among the prophets that there is a relentless self-criticism that is not only permitted, but is preserved. The fact that we still have the words of Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Joel, Obadiah, all of the prophets, is a real tribute to the idea that criticism of the society, that expansive speech beyond what one would expect, is not only allowed, but valued, treasured. And so you have both tendencies in the Jewish tradition. You do have the tendency to restrict speech, and I'll say more about that in a minute, and you have the tendency to preserve a range of expression. Now, freedom of speech, as we think of it, is much more a legacy of the Greek world than the Jewish world. However, there too, you know that freedom of speech was restricted. And how do we know this? Because Socrates gets put to death for saying things that they didn't want him to say. He didn't steal money, he didn't beat anyone up, but he was fomenting ideas that people didn't like. And he was basically put to death sort of for sedition, for corrupting the minds of the youth. And the equivalent in the Jewish tradition is machtiat harabim, somebody who causes the many to sin. And you can cause the many to sin in a variety of ways, but one of the ways is by teaching heretical teachings. And if you do that, then the court has the right to shut you up. So when we come to the modern age and we are aware of the contradictions in our own thinking, by the way, because nobody wants all speech, or I shouldn't say nobody, very, very few people want all speech to be free. I think if somebody made, for example, a movie or a TV show, or was going around themselves glorifying pedophilia and arguing for it, I think most people would believe that that is speech that ought not to be permitted. And of course, you inevitably, as we will see again and again in these various legal cases, you inevitably deal with the slope that is always slippery. That is, if you say no to this, then why don't you say no to that, and no to that, and no to that, and no to that? And somewhere on every slope, a line must be drawn. So the question is not, does one tradition permit free speech and another forbid it? The question is, how broad, how elastic are the boundaries of the speech that is permitted in any given tradition? In some, they are much more restricted. There are some traditions where you may not deviate from the orthodoxy. And there are also some divisions of certain traditions where that is true. There were, even in the most observant literalist communities in Judaism, there were some where dissent and argument was more valued and some where it was less valued. And the model of it in the Jewish tradition was less free speech than argumentative speech. And that may seem like the same thing, but it isn't entirely the same thing. That is, to the extent that you could argue the points in the Talmud, you could make almost any kind of argument. But you couldn't make the argument that the Talmud was trash, that there was nothing sacred about the Torah. In other words, inside the system, there is tremendous variation in terms of what people can say and still be considered a valid part of the system and be allowed to express their opinions. But once you stepped outside the system and evaluated it badly, then you could no longer speak those words, at least not in the community that would want to accept you. So Judaism has, traditionally had cherem, which is when people are excommunicated from the community, and very often for sins of speech. And in fact, if you look at the Yom Kippur litany of misdeeds, sins of speech vastly outnumber other kinds of sins, because most of the time those are our sins, right? Because we do more talking than we do any doing. And the Chafetz Chaim, who was Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kogan, lived in the last, now 2 centuries ago, in the 19th century in Poland, made his very, very considerable reputation in Jewish circles, primarily, not exclusively, the Mishnah Berurah also, but primarily on his works on Shmirat HaLashon, on guarding one's tongue, on the things that could, according to Jewish law, be permitted to be said and things that couldn't. And if you think about the laws against lashon hara, against evil speech, and richilut, against gossip, and motzi shem ra, slander and libel, all those things are Jewish laws. So there are many laws that actually are intended to restrict the kind of speech that people are allowed to do. I would say somebody who would take a measuring stick of Jewish law to Twitter or Facebook or Snapchat or TikTok or Instagram or any of the social media, some more than others, would find innumerable violations of the laws of Jewish speaking and Jewish discourse. So it is a vast exaggeration to say that Judaism promotes free speech. It is a fair characterization, I think, to say that Judaism generally promotes dispute, varying points of view, argument, even sometimes shocking and unusual points of view, and gives them a wide berth. In some societies, by the way, more than others, one of the phenomenon that we haven't talked about, but which is true, is the more secure the society, the more likely it is to allow for freer speech. Places where there are real concerns about the social fabric, people tend to restrict the way others can talk because they feel like the wrong thing having been said, the world could unravel. And certainly different Jewish communities, given different situations, had different experiences with speech. The most famous example, and then I'll take the question, the most famous example being the 17th century with Baruch Spinoza, where we don't know exactly what he was excommunicated for, but it seems pretty clear from his writings that Spinoza was excommunicated for holding ideas that were considered heretical at the time, philosophical ideas that were considered heretical. Virginia says, originally freedom of speech in the US meant that you could openly criticize the government without fear of retribution. Exactly so. The point is that the government in Judaism is God. And that is the difference. And God's representatives on earth, which are the reason that you couldn't traditionally criticize the monarch, because the monarch had the refracted sovereignty of the great sovereign, was God's representative on earth, made it so difficult to criticize secular forms of government because they were considered secular, right? The divine right of kings. And in the Jewish tradition, until much later, kings were also considered kings by divine right. David, after all, was appointed by God. So in some ways, to criticize David would seem like it was criticizing God. And the origin, I mean, now free speech in America has to do a lot with social fabric and what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. Criticizing the government is fairly standard and obviously universally permitted. On the right and on the left, I can't think of any government that doesn't get its fair share of criticism. But the right to criticize the religious authorities, who are presumably in one way or another approved of, appointed by, blessed by, elevated by God, is a much dicier undertaking. And so the fundamental principle of free speech doesn't work quite the same way in Judaism, couldn't work quite the same way in Judaism. There's just no neutral playing ground. I mean, part of the reason that you can criticize the government in the United States is the very sensible assumption that the people who run the government are no better than you are, right? They may be elected, but that doesn't give them some kind of preternatural wisdom. That's not true in the Jewish tradition. Being a Torah scholar is supposed to give you some kind of preternatural wisdom, at least in the realms covered by Jewish law. And I don't know if people outside the traditional world are aware of the degree of reverence and respect that are accorded to great scholars of Torah. You rise when they enter the room. You don't interrupt them when they're speaking. You solicit their advice in all sorts of things. And that kind of deference is much, much less common than it once was, just socially in general. There was a time when people would do that, believe it or not, for university professors. So partly it's the structures of authority have crumbled in general in society, but also there is still the maintenance of a difference in Jewish and secular learning. So other questions or comments? I haven't seen any others. Speech is most powerful when drives action or belief. Otherwise, empty words, less of a mandate. Well, I mean, I understand, Marla, what you're saying, but I don't agree. There's a lot of art. A lot of novels don't necessarily, poetry changes nothing, as one famous poet said. You can move, elevate, inspire, educate with words. You can do a lot with words that don't necessarily motivate belief. So I don't consider, for example, a sermon on a Shabbat morning a failure if somebody doesn't go out and do something as a result of the sermon. It's a particular success if they do, but it doesn't mean that there's no value if they don't. You remind me, though, however, in your favor is the beautiful distinction of Plutarch on the difference between Cicero and Demosthenes. Both of them great orators in Greece and Rome, respectively. And Plutarch says, when Cicero spoke, at the end, everyone would say, what a fine speech. When Demosthenes spoke, everyone said, let us march. So who was the better orator? I think it's clear that Plutarch thinks, and we think, that Demosthenes was, because he motivates people to action. And I would say in the end, that's the purpose of oratory, but it may not be the purpose of all speech, of poetry, of words of comfort, of lullabies, of nighttime stories, of God knows what else. So there's a tremendous variety of functions served by the human word. Please elaborate on the difference between thoughts and expressions of thoughts. One are expressed and one are just thought. I'm not sure how much more there is to say about it, other than you can think what you want. What you are allowed to say or not allowed to say really varies according to the society. So for the most part, and there are some slight exceptions, for the most part, Judaism does not judge your internal states. It doesn't say if you think this, you're a terrible human being. And I say for the most part, there are exceptions to that. But it does judge your actions. So if you contemplate killing somebody and you don't do anything, then you're okay. But if you kill someone, then you're subject to the full force of Jewish law and condemnation. Because the assumption is that to express the thought, whether in words or in deed, is a wholly different enterprise from merely thinking something. And that's one of the reasons why you can have freedom of speech. You can't have freedom of action. Freedom of action means you can do whatever you want. So you can drive 120 miles down Santa Monica Boulevard. You can't have freedom of action and have a successful society. You can have a wide range of action, but you can't have freedom of action. This is, by the way, this is, and I'm not going to take sides on it at the moment. And I'm not going to argue about it. But this is precisely the argument about things like vaccinations, where one person says it's entirely within my freedom, and the other person says, no, it's about public safety and it has to do with me too, whether you're vaccinated or not. But the argument is, how much freedom of action do you have to do different things in society? And, as the old phrase has it, my freedom to swing my fist ends at your face, right? So I don't have a freedom to do whatever I want if it impacts you. And you can make an analogy with words, that my freedom of speech is restricted by the severity and immediacy of its impact. It's the fire in a crowded theater example. If you're going to say something that could cause panic and harm, then that can be restricted. Now, in the Jewish tradition, if you're going to say something that is going to diminish God in the world, that can be restricted. That's called blasphemy. That's not a category that America could, should, would recognize, but it is very much a category that monotheistic faith recognize. I mean, I remember thinking when Jews, when there was all the to-do about the Muhammad cartoons, it's not as though Judaism doesn't have, in its most traditional form, similar prohibitions, not about drawing a picture of Moses, but similar prohibitions about drawing a picture of God or drawing pictures that make fun of revered figures or so on. There are differences, obviously, but what I'm saying is that all the faith traditions do have a natural urge to want to contain that speech, which is dangerous to the maintenance of their belief and their community. What else? What else have we got that people want to ask about? No. I'd love to hear you. Okay. So, Rabbi Herber, Jacob Herber, mentions the well-known rabbinic dictum, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. This and that are the words of the living God. So this goes back to what I said earlier about the fact that Judaism preserves less freedom of speech than freedom of argument. That is, taking two sides in a dispute is considered to be not just kosher, but laudatory. And I say laudatory because, for example, in capital cases, the junior judges in the Sanhedrin express themselves before the senior judges. Why? Because they might take different opinions than the senior judges, and they didn't want them to be intimidated by the fact that the senior spoke first, and then they would not be able to say what they wanted to say. So the idea that contrary opinions are valued and important and also should be preserved is central to Judaism, which is why in the Talmud you have all these minority opinions. Why are they there? If they're overruled, why do they need to be there? Because they may prove of value in the future, and also because you should keep both sides of the argument. So the specific phrase that Rabbi Herber refers to is that the arguments between Hillel and Shammai, even though the Talmud says it went primarily according to Beit Hillel, because of the way they conducted themselves in arguments, because they learned Beit Shammai's arguments, because they would recite Beit Shammai's arguments before themselves. Beit Shammai, by the way, just means the house of Shammai. Beit Hillel means the house of Hillel. In other words, the two schools of the two rabbis. But in the end, this and that, Elu ve'elu, this and that, are the words of the living God. In other words, God does not reside in one point of view. And in this, I think, Judaism does have something very powerful and important to say to the current debate. And that is, if you believe in God, or even if you don't, but especially if you do, then you have to be conscious how limited is the intelligence of human beings, how partial, how much we don't know, how we are the products of a certain time and place, and a certain breeding and certain parents. And I've never met a person in general. Everybody speaks a specific language, was born in a certain place, on and on and on and on. And that means that there's just a lot of the world that we don't know and we don't understand. And that consciousness, the consciousness of humility, is unfortunately almost gone in our days. People are so certain of their grand things, even, by the way, let's be honest, about things we know very little about, right? People make all sorts. One day they're, epidemiologists, and the next day they're climatologists, and the next day they're political analysts, and they make the same, and they say it with the same certitude as if they really knew something about it. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could return to a certain tentativeness? This really seems clear to me, but I'm ready to be corrected. I'm ready to learn more. I'm not dogmatic about this, because I've learned elu ve'elu, both what I say and also what the other guy says. They both are the words of the living God. So in that sense, I believe that Judaism has a great deal to teach the world. And you will see as we go through these various issues over the months ahead, that Judaism sees different sides of most issues and is able to illuminate, I think, things that sometimes make it uncomfortable for us to hear, because nobody likes to have their point of view contradicted. And we tend to associate our point of view with the Jewish point of view if we're Jewish. And to hear that Judaism actually doesn't agree with us is painful and difficult, but also growthful. So stick with us. I hope you will join me tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock Pacific time in the morning for Toldot and for Torah study. I will see you here. And in the meantime, have a beautiful day. And